Hello, my name is Bear Shea, and I am the DOE Mental Health and School Counselor Specialist. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about trauma-informed practices and ways that we can increase our understanding and awareness, and also some practical ways that we can include some trauma-informed practices within our modules, particularly in this more unique setting. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time just going over some of the definitions so that we can really be intentional in what we're doing moving forward. So when we think about trauma and we think about how we define it and what it means, it's a pretty loaded word. And I know clinically it's something that we talk about a lot, and it's almost become sort of a medical term, right? When we think about capital T trauma. And so in some ways that's good because we want it to be significant, and trauma has a significant impact on our lives and others' lives. However, we also want to be mindful that sometimes we talk about it very, sort of just like other sort of like illnesses that we've just sort of gotten used to hearing all the time. And so it actually in some ways has lessened the impact or the meaning of it, as well as we tend to use it like, oh, that was traumatizing. And that we, in the clinical field, we tend to kind of refer to that as the difference between a lowercase t trauma as we use it socially versus capital T trauma and its impact. So it's sort of an important difference, and just to be aware that this is a significant piece. But trauma is really that emotional response to the perceived significant threat of safety. And there's a couple of key pieces to that, because that's a really simple definition for a really complex topic. It's an emotional response, so it's something that we feel within our bodies, and it's even more than that. It's not like it's just how we feel, but it's actually how things get coded into our bodies, so into our brains and how we respond, and that is at a more significant level. It's actually at a biological level. And then the perceived threat. So it's this idea that, we would imagine that some of the most horrifying things that can happen to people would cause trauma. But the other part of that is that it really comes down to perception. So some people might survive some really horrible things and not be traumatized. And somebody else could have what we might think is a really insignificant thing happen to them and be significantly traumatized. So that perception is really, really an important piece, and it's not something that we can minimize because it really is unique to people. And really the whole piece comes down to safety, right? And us feeling safe and secure, and something that threatens that safety. And there's three ways that trauma is really coded for us. There's sort of the classic single event traumas, which could be like a car accident or getting hurt. It could be something as simple as like a child getting lost in a crowd, and that could cause capital T trauma for the child. It could also cause capital T trauma for the adult. Moving, new schools, friend moves away, the end of a relationship. Those can be sort of single event pieces that can cause that sort of emotional response and threat to safety. There's ongoing trauma, and this tends to be more intense. So think about it as like lots of single event traumas that sort of continue to happen in. That's why harassment and bullying is something that is such a big piece, as well as divorce, which might start as a single event, but then become ongoing, continuing traumas. Neglect is a really significant form of trauma for us and for our brains. And it's something that goes on over and over and over and over and over again. It's not just a single event. It's something that sort of continues as long as the neglect and lack of safety and lack of support is happening. There's also a third category, which is really complex trauma, which can be multiples of these, where maybe there's a single event that happens within, while someone is experiencing ongoing trauma. And then one of the really more important parts of complex trauma can be sort of societal or situational. So when we think about, generational poverty, food and home insecurity, like these are things that are key to us as safety, right? Wars. Persecution. So when we think about racism, sexism, homophobia, like these are situations caused by our society that have impact on our safety, and so therefore fall into that complex trauma category. And they're complex because there's multiple levels of them. So there can be sort of the individual, there can be the institutional, the societal, And then additional facts that can play into complex trauma. So if we have mental health, other mental health barriers, if we have other physical health barriers and our own resources and supports, those can play into and make trauma that much more complex. And so those are also things that can add to complex trauma and are really important to be aware of. So what does it mean to be trauma informed? When we talk about developing modules that are trauma informed, it's really about creating that awareness, recognizing those impacts, and having this overall understanding so that trauma isn't just this extreme thing that happens to somebody in a way of addressing it as a mental health issue, but that trauma can permeate every part of a person's life, and that we may not be aware that how we are interacting with someone can be traumatizing or re-traumatizing them. And so it's having that understanding and trying to build in supports. It doesn't mean that we're going to be able to build in all of the supports or that our material will completely avoid traumatizing someone. There's no way to prepare for that, and that's okay. But having that understanding and being able to put in place things that recognize and support somebody is a way of mitigating that. So really looking at our modules as a system that are going to include those safeguards and protections, and really thinking about everything that we're doing with a focus on what is safe. It doesn't mean sanitizing. It doesn't mean, taking out all of the difficult things. Really, the challenge in our lives is something that is really important for us to grow and change. And challenge by itself isn't traumatizing. Those are separate things. Right? And so we want to create challenging situations that are safe enough to allow us to grow and develop without being traumatized. Another really key important of this part is creating connections so that we're allowing the brain to have a larger web and a larger system of supports. So that's really what trauma informed means. And it's what we want to start to think about, because really, we are looking at this, asynchronous, student-led, platform-based, this piece that we're trying to do with MOOSE to provide this amazing resource for students, for them to be able to access education, and make it as low barrier as possible. And this is an amazing thing. On top of it, we're talking about including supports that traditionally would be led by us as educators. And it's having this awareness that, we would normally teach material that might be heavy or intense, and we would be there to mitigate it. We would know the students, we would know what things were going to be difficult for them, and we would just sort of naturally be able to provide some of those supports. We know that that's not going to be the same because we might not have those supports at home. We might not have some of the practical resources. That students' life experience as they're going through these modules is really going to take into account, as well as sort of the speed. When we think about pacing, what is that going to feel like if we're covering really intense subjects? And that's the other thing, is what are we covering? There are many, many intense parts of our history that are really important to learn about. And so how are we going to go through those? What are the ways that we're going to try to be conscious of not just the intensity of violence or war, but about some of those other societal pieces when we think about, persecution and isms, right? So if we have students that are LGBT, that are, of a minority race, that are have a different life experience or come from a different country or even a different state, all of those pieces are going to have a cultural shift that will be different for the impact of these topics. And we need to try to be aware of that and thoughtful when we are approaching things. When we're thinking about cultural depictions, and we tend to have when we are teaching, we're teaching from the winning side, right? So history tends to be written by the victors and tends to be written from a very, white-centered, colonizing point of view. There are other histories, there are alternative histories that are available for significant periods of time. And it's really important to present those as a rounded experience so that students are really getting the whole part of what happened. And I think that's something to be aware of around current events. We're talking about making a module that's asynchronous, and as much as current events are impacting us right now and the excitement for including those in modules, what is that module going to be then next year? Are those pieces going to still be that significant? Is it a way that we can take the larger societal piece as a nod to the current events without getting into some of the depth of current events and maybe some of the triggering that's going on for that? So those are just some things to be aware of, as well as just a general inequality, and that we're, some students that are going to be logging onto this may already be experiencing a lot of the things that we're talking about, and not just assuming that they're not. So those are some of the things just to sort of keep in the back of our heads as we're developing those models. So if this is trauma informed, and these are all the things we have to worry about, what can we actually do? What are the pieces we can provide? And this is where I've seen Q1 modules really try to create some new resources. This is something that really hasn't been done yet, or hadn't been done before. And so what are the things we can take from the Q1, and what are things that we can think of moving forward? Think about ways that when we're covering intense subjects, what are systems we can put in place that can acknowledge that these are going to be tough, to give students some awareness of like, hey, we're going to be talking about a really difficult subject. These are some of the things that might come up, right? There might be, religious persecution, race persecution, there might be violence, there might be death, there might be suicide, loss, domestic violence. All of these things are things that we can pre-warn a student so that they can choose whether to continue or not, as well as talking about what are the supports that we can provide. So whether that's linking to some of the SEL lessons that maybe exist and having supports built in, some coping skills to sort of to breathe and take space, as well as what are supports that are surrounding students, right? Really having that pre-teaching where we are saying, hey, these are some of the things that we're going to go through. This is what we're going to offer. And then having those check-ins specifically built in at different times. Like, all right, we just went through a pretty heavy section of this module. Let's check in with ourselves and, do some self-awareness and figure out where we're at. What do we need? Maybe it's time to take a break and reflect on what's been going on. Here are some resources to think about this in a different way. Here are some resources to show some of the positives that have come out of this, sort of change some of the perceptions around that. But having those check-ins may be a really significant way of reducing it. And if a student doesn't need those check-ins, if it's not affecting them in that intense way, they don't need, they can sort of say, nope, I'm good, and move into the next section, right? We know the same way with students in our class. Some are going to seem totally fine, and then others can be really significantly impacted from material. And so we're sort of creating multiple avenues for that within our modules. Another thing to consider is having students reflect on what the supports are they're already using and reaching out to those supports when things become intense. Those are all good practical things that we can include. There's a whole other side to that as far as mitigating the impact of the material. The other side is, really horrible things happen in the world. And even if they don't happen to us, they're happening to other people right now. And so what are the things that we can do to not just be crushed by that information? And if we have already survived trauma in our lives, that awareness of other people's trauma is actually much more significant. And so it's important to give power to those survivors and show them ways that they can have positive impacts on the world. Obviously, that's good for everybody, but it's a really great way to embed power into our modules in positive ways. So what are ways that they're connecting to others? What are ways that they're interviewing other survivors, or interviewing or engaging in doing some community work? And I know that we're going to have students that are interacting all over the state, and so it's not always it's not something we can always spell out. But what are some ways that they can connect? How can we link them to resources so that they can become engaged in their own community? And really looking at voice and power and the sort of strength that provides, and the resilience that adds to for students who have experienced trauma. So those are some of the practical pieces we can add in. And this is something that we're developing ongoing. And really it goes back to that informed place of when we have that awareness and understanding, it allows us to build in those supports in creative ways. And so all of that really comes down to how we're supporting students, how we're creating safety within modules while also exploring difficult subject matter. We don't want to erase that. We don't want to pretend like it didn't happen. It's really important for students to know that these things have happened. And how are we providing those supports within these modules? It's a very difficult task, and it's something that support team will be here to continue to work with to make sure that we can try to come up with new ways of doing this. So thank you so much for tackling this challenge. It's going to be such a great resource for students, and particularly for vulnerable students who haven't been able to access some of this before. So thanks so much, and I hope this is helpful. Please reach out with any questions.